Ever since I saw this gigantic woman, I was absolutely enamored. Sorry. I had absolutely no idea who she was. I had absolutely no idea who these people were, and I had absolutely no idea what was going on with this giant throne. Totally lost. I scavenged the Eternal City like a meteor digger, looking for any clues to her origin, or hell, why is she even so big? Even what was she to the Nox or Newman? She was throned, revered, and there was another smaller one like her in another Eternal City, with 2 other thrones housing no corpse. I followed the waterways leading through each Eternal City, and at the end I found a massive pile of corpses, and a lake of rot, which I believe were the missing denizens of the nameless Eternal City. The city missing one of these thrones, which seems to strangely have appeared in Celia. You can see in this video here what I think the unfortunate denizens were used for, but that was where the trail ended. And it did not answer a single question about who this was. But I did have my guesses. Previously, the base game has established a link between Marika, the Black Knives, and the Eternal Cities. Which I mean, even at a surface level of deep makes sense because Marika the Eternal Cities. Okay, gotcha. So in my head, as Marika is a certified VIP, if she was a Newman of the Eternal Cities, she would undoubtedly be an important one. Perhaps even maybe one of 3 Empyreans of an age past. Meaning, regardless, one of these thrones was likely for her. But what function did these crypt chairs, these thrones, have? I still couldn't put my finger on it. And then the DLC dropped. And then the grandmother was introduced. And the Newman being Shaman originally was a thing, or at least a link between the 2 was established. And then I got a good look at the grandmother's tree. Scattered throughout Elden Ring are huge gravestones, dotting a hole at the very top of them. And at the back of the grandmother's tree, we see a familiar shape. Many of the graves in the Shadow Realm as well themselves are described as spiritual in nature. So, if this tree is a crypt, or grave, for the grandmother, what does that mean? And what are the implications? And what does the hole itself actually mean? Well, throughout the DLC we find tutelary deities. These tutelary deities are positioned in a very familiar looking way, and are reminiscent of the grandmothers. However, instead of their hands outreached, seeming to merge with the tree in a giving gesture, their hands are pulled in front of them, with the blessing of the spirit ash pulling in front of them, and their broken torso. This is very reminiscent of the Shardu tree's warped form, broken with its bounty pulling into a chalice. So if there was a link between these things, what is it? And can it give us insight into what the grandmother is doing in this tree? And what this hole even means? And further yet, how does that link to the giant woman on this mysterious throne? Well, buckle up. In this installment of the Lore of the Grandmother, I'll be exploring the meaning behind the grandmother's ritual entombment and how it has evolved over time. Information that I believe will be critical to identifying these figures. The Hornsent have a habit of taking technology from other species or races from a different age and turning them into weapons of power to advance their civilization. They have scholars who research ancient antiquities and derive from them important knowledge. We see this in their mimicry of the crucibles of the Giant's Forge, a giant melting pot of life, and the jars, giant melting pots of life. We see this in Eni Ilim and its likeness to Farum Azula, with bodies being used to comprise the very structure and prompt a crucible. See here for more information on that. We see this in the Shaman, using the properties of their very bodies as a base for living jars. We also see this in the creation of sprite stones, which are Rauh Burrows, circles, used to trap or inhabit a sprite for the purpose of manipulating the sprite, in this case into a weapon akin to a holy hand grenade. And according to the records left by Hornsent scholars, there were also contrivances known as bondstones that could manipulate the moment a sprite vanishes after the sprite stone is used, which was sort of like a remote detonator. This technology thought lost to antiquity was an implement used in rituals, lost to time, recovered by horn-scent scholars from the ancient ruins of Rauh. However, we do not see it used in its capacity as a ritual implement, as I believe though their function was recovered and copied, that being their ability to trap a sprite, their intended purpose and use as a ritual implement was lost to time. Instead, in typical horn-scent fashion, we see what they recovered used as a weapon. There are many things this ritual could have been, such as using the sprite to power things like golems. However, my main point is that this circular ritual object was used to capture and manipulate sprites, or spiritual energy. So, how does this relate back to the Shaman grandmother, or the gravestones I mentioned earlier? Well, atop the gravestones and the Shaman grandmother's tree, we see a hole, similar to that of the Rauh Burrow, where the sprites are held. I would wager this is indicative of the ritual lost to time, the capturing of a sprite at the moment of death. But for what? As proof of concept for what I'm about to suggest, we see in those sorcerers who seek to peer beyond the truth of stone, the primeval Glintstone sorcerers, the capability of carving out their own spirit, or soul, or sprite, and infusing it into a glintstone, making effectively a horcrux of sorts. The primal glintstone blade reads, "An old glintstone blade that has been stained with blood." The old sorcerers would slice open their own hearts with these blades to imbue a primal glintstone with their soul, and thus did they die. Sellen's primal glintstone reads, "Glintstone from within the sorceress Sellen's body, seemingly half alive, blood vessels are visible from within." In essence, a primal glintstone is a sorcerer's soul. If transplanted into a new, compatible body after their original body dies, the sorcerer will rise again. We see this essentially in effect in Sellen's questline. I believe the function of this tree burial is similar in nature to this function, and the same goes for the crypt throne. A shaman is defined as a person regarded as having access to and influence in the world of good and evil spirits. I would place my bets that the shaman themselves were the original spirit tuners. For example, we see in the descendants of the shaman, Marika's offspring, the ability to summon and ride spectral steeds, and summon spirits to fight by their side. I have another example of spirit calling bells that belong to Marika that are very reminiscent of the crypt thrones, but I'll get to those a little later. For now, I'll move on. I just wanted to establish that Marika herself and the culture she comes from know their stuff about spirits. The only other entities we see referred to as shaman in the game are the spiritual beast followers, who are absolutely engrossed in the manipulation of spirits, and on circular earrings as well, right below spiritually powered horns. As with many cultures who pass their teachings, secret rituals, and history down by various methods to the next leader, I would argue this burial and the manipulation of the sprite is a twofold ritual, both to give the grandmother's body back to the earth, to perhaps the great tree or a great tree, to feed it. Remember that for later. And for those that aren't aware, the great tree being the original tree before the Shadow tree or Erdtree, but that will be in the next video, and to pass her mind, her spirit, with the collected history of the previous grandmothers to the next chosen grandmother, perhaps akin to the Glintstone sorcerer's soul transfer, but more likely, in my opinion, akin to a knowledge transfer. Thus, Marika the Eternal. Thus, the Eternal Cities. I say twofold as perhaps a hint, perhaps not, but the hat which Ymir dons has a familiar circle atop it, which says the following. The circular design at the top represents the greater will and its lightless abyss, imparting increased intelligence and arcane to the wearer. Notably, the holes in the giant gravestones have a fingerprint adorning them. I would argue this ritual is of a similar nature to the description of that hat. The arcane is the body returned to the great tree's roots via this tree burial, and the intelligence, the memories and/or spirit passed to the next grandmother to keep the culture, rituals, and history eternal. I believe this mimicry of what was a shaman grandmother's ritual is another example of the horn scent taking a method or ritual or technology from another race or species and turning it into a perverse shadow of it, for other means. Instead of giving themselves to the tree and their mind to the next leader, the bounty, like the wounded Shardu tree, is bled into the palm, like the chalice, collecting the spiritual essence or spiritual power, further reinforcing what this ritual was about, having likely been what the Hornsent derived this ritual from after the Shaman oppression. All good and well, but how does that relate to her? The circle on the tree being similar to those on the graves and Rauh Burrows, used to house spirits, the association of shamans with spirits already. In addition to the rip-off version of this practice seemingly done to harvest spiritual essence, suggests to me that this ritual was about the manipulation of the spirit, possibly one to impart or direct the body and or soul of the individual, akin to what we see in the Glintstone soul transfer. If this crypt throne was of the same nature as this ritual, if the figures were in fact grandmothers themselves, we would expect to see some of the function of these thrones be related to the manipulation of spirits. Well, returning to the association between Marika, the Black Knives, and the Eternal City, and the fact that Marika is also a shaman, we would expect to see elements of the ancestors' culture appear in this one, seemingly a little further down the line from a humble village. I believe this is seen in the tree burials of the grandmothers in the shaman village, and the crypt chair burials of the grandmothers of the Eternal City. To start things off, the crypt thrones have a great ghost glovewort in the chest beneath them to comfort the spirit of the individual on the chair, accompanying a respective important item, and the figures on and around them seem to be wailing in despair. Except on one of these thrones with wailing figures, and no ghost glovewort, with no corpse occupying it. And in another city, there are no people at all, no wailing figures, and the throne is missing altogether, possibly appearing strangely in Celia as the town's secret. Perhaps very telling to the nature of those thrones is what we find under this special crypt throne, Lusat's staff, which alludes to what lies beyond the wisdom of stone.
Our art draws upon the powers embedded in Glintstone. But what is the nature of such power? Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while Glintstone contains residual life and thus the vitality of the stars.
Perhaps in reference to these primeval sorcerers who would transfer their souls. I have a theory about the implications of this that I'll explore a little bit further on, and they're quite huge, but for now I'd like to continue with establishing the connection between the tree and crypt chair burials, and the function they may fulfill. The symbol on the back of the crypt thrones of the Eternal Cities is a tree, I believe symbolizing the tree at the back of the grandmother in her tree crypt. But it's also very reminiscent of the back of the Hornsent tutelary deities, like inverses of each other and this ritual, the shaman grandmothers giving themselves to the trees, becoming or merging with the trees as seen in these two images, while I would guess the tutelary deities drank the blessing of the Shardu tree, similar to the best warriors of the Erdtree era, being rewarded with the Erdtree sap, and in turn gained these tree-like features and grander stature, like Godfrey and his knights. While they aren't necessarily sprouting trees themselves, the concept art shows roots growing from the skeleton in this image, and this crypt throne is being engulfed by roots. However, I have another theory on the function of the crypt thrones, but we'll get to that. To reinforce these associations, particularly of Marika and the Eternal Cities, and therefore likely one of these crypt thrones, specifically the missing nameless one that appears in Celia, and the association of the crypt thrones and the manipulation and lulling of spirits to these spiritual crypts being a core part of the shaman culture for a process likely akin to soul transfer or spirit essence transfer, or spirit manipulation at the very least, we also find in the nameless Eternal City, which I believe to belong to Marika, a mausoleum, or mobile crypt throne, that is said to house the unwanted children of Marika, of which there are 7 in the base game. The symbology on these mausoleums is strikingly similar, if not exact, to the symbology on the crypt thrones. I believe this reinforces the function of the crypt thrones as similar in nature to these mausoleums. a tool to manipulate the spirit of the deceased in some way. Noting, of course, that their function in-game is to copy a remembrance. Regardless, this function to manipulate spirits being similar to the ritual of the shaman grandmothers in the tree, having their spirit manipulated for a purpose upon death. They also each boast a tree on their outside. We see the same pattern adorning the crypt thrones on these mausoleums, and above the 7 points residing inside, we see a familiar hole, denoting likely these mausoleums each as an intended resting place for the souls of Marika's children. To top it off, a giant bell is under these mausoleums, likely to call the spirits of her deceased children to guide them, should they perish. I really just wanted to bring up these mausoleums as another tie between Marika and the Eternal Cities, and this method of soul or spirit manipulation in the Shaman and Numen cultures, as I feel like the striking similarities between the crypt thrones and the mausoleums can't be ignored, and are just further evidence for the crypt thrones being a part of a ritual or manner of processing or directing spirits. And I think the next example really hammers it home. As yet another example of a tie between Marika and the Eternal Cities, specifically the Nameless one, to really bring this full circle, we find Godwyn, first son of Marika, in the position of a failed tutelary deity, really the precursor to what a complete tutelary deity would be, and how its position is likely started, slumping into what we see upon death, in a nameless eternal city that does not have a crypt throne. Instead, embedded into a tree, like the grandmother and her tree crypt, or primitive crypt throne, and this is referred to as his throne, in a city missing one. So we have the elements of all three of these processes, the merging with a tree as we see with the grandmothers, the position of the tutelary deities, and the fact that he is on what is referred to as a throne, in an eternal city that is missing a crypt throne. I never understood why he was positioned in this way where he is, but given what we have just discussed, now I think I have a great idea as to why, and that this was just a repurposing of the different aspects of each of these processes by the perpetrator of the Night of Black Knives, in my opinion, Ranni, aka Marika. You can see this video here to explain that little tidbit. His body is embedded into the roots, just like the grandmother into the tree, to give himself back to the tree like the grandmothers did. However, what he is giving back to the Erdtree is his rotting, blighted body, to poison it. Marika's greatest foe and prison. Meanwhile, he's in the position of the tutelary deity, perhaps assuring that his soul is pulled somewhere to be manipulated, above where Godwyn is throned. In a similar fashion to the Erdtree chalice and the tutelary deity's hands, is a chalice by a minor Erdtree, and a collection of very strange characters, acting in place of a tree guardian for this minor Erdtree. They use exclusively death magic, unlike any of their counterparts, and they're defending a very special combination of cracked tears found in the chalice. The crimson crystal tear, which denotes physical health, so the body, and the twiggy cracked tear, which reads, "The resulting concoction prevents one's runes from being lost upon death." Interesting, no? I wonder if this is symbolic of Godwyn's soul being captured at the moment of death, before it was recycled, or destroyed by Ranni. Or maybe his soul was housed somewhere else entirely. I'm not so sure, but I still found it very interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments. So if everything we have run through is true, then we can take a damn good guess at who these people are. They are grandmothers. As for specifically who, I have 3 running theories about the identities of these throned figures. However, for the sake of brevity, my main theory is as follows. This grandmother, upon her death, used the crypt thrones, which is an altered version of this shaman ritual and horn-scent ripoff, to achieve something more akin to a soul split, like the sorcerers in their Glintstone transfer, like Marika and Radagon, perhaps. I really do feel like this is supported by the presence of Lusat's staff under this crypt throne, and its description, which speaks of the wisdom of stone, likely alluding to the fact that Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos, where all life comes from, thus the soul transfer technique by Glintstone. This results in 3 daughters, all aspects of herself divided. These 3 daughters would be the rulers of the Eternal City. I am almost certain that the crypt throne that would be in the nameless Eternal City, likely the one that shows up in Celia as the town's secret, is Marika's. Considering all of the connections she has to the Eternal Cities, and then specifically the nameless Eternal City that I mentioned earlier, the last push I personally needed was the overt change in design for the chest of the secret crypt throne, going from the Eternal City design to the Erdtree and lions. You'll probably understand why I like this theory if you've seen my previous video on Marika, detailing how she too split portions of herself off in order to achieve certain goals by creating sentient Horcruxes in Radagon and potentially Godwyn and Rani, akin to Mikola and Saint Trina, and potentially later. You can see both of those here. As for the identity of the other 2, Marika's sister, perhaps one of them is the Glomide Queen, given that we have ghost flames through all of the Eternal Cities, which are blue, and the portion that Malekith stole from Death is red, and blue and red make purple, or gloam, as per the Grave Violet description. I believe it's also entirely possible that the 2 missing figures from their crypt thrones are right here. One sister performing some sort of spiritual transfer ritual, perhaps endowed or taught to them by the Greater Will, or a method of communicating with the Greater Will, and this explains Marika's path and alliance, and the other, whose village was butchered, directed her spirit elsewhere. If there is any credence to the fact her tree has no hole where the spirit can rest before use, then perhaps where this tree is seemingly pointing may be an indication as to where that soul instead went. And if that's the truth, if where the tree points matters, then wouldn't it make sense that where these 2 figures are facing also matters? Interesting how this headless body in this massacred village that likely underwent mass despair appears to be facing Midra's Manse, where a host of headless bodies lie after a certain maiden may be introduced to little collective madness from pent-up despair, and the snakeskin her tree seemingly points to faces the peaks of the dragon tyrant, Baal. But for now, I'm leaving it here. That is a topic I'll be exploring in the next installation of the Lore of the Grandmother, their timeline. On that note, with all the information now on the plate, hopefully you can appreciate the monumental task of putting together a timeline for this. My ambition for this video was to associate this practice with the manipulation of the spirit across different generations or time periods for Shaman or Newman, and try to establish what this practice does, all to give us the information we need to identify these figures. There are themes that tie together all of these things, including the patterns on the thrones, mausoleums, clothing, architecture of different cultures, that paint a timeline of these grandmothers. For example, the garbs on the throne figures are painfully close in colour and design to the garbs worn by Nanaya, and this very particular pattern, perhaps one very indicative of a timeline, and honestly, it's a big one, a supermassive rabbit hole. I believe these patterns follow and in many ways explain the progression of the grandmothers and their culture. And I'll be going in on these details in my next video, which will be exploring the timeline of the grandmothers. As to recount the history of the grandmothers is to recount the history of time immemorial. A journey from one humble culture across the entire timeline to a return to antiquity, ensuing writing and metalwork. Entirely worth and requiring its own video, don't you agree? I'll end with an example of why timelines can be so vexing, And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the matter, because this one in particular really annoys me, and I believe really only as a community we can solve these mysteries. That said, does size matter? What does it mean? Why are some knights bigger than others? Why is Godfrey so huge? Why is Renala so huge compared to wizards? Why are tree sentinels and knight riders so big? Why are black knives so tall compared to tarnished? Why is the towering sister so towering? Why are some of Marika's children so much bigger than others, but still, regardless, quite big? Why big crab? Why small crab? Why big octopus? Why small octopus? I've had it suggested to me that size is indicative of time. Things are larger further back in time, and there is definitely some credence to this, and it very well may be right. However, I theorize that in fact it is maybe indicative of power. How so? Well, the champions of the Erdtree were rewarded with the sap of the Erdtree. The Crucible Knights, Godfrey, assumedly the Tree Sentinels and Golden Knights, Knight Riders of Morgoth, all drank the sap of the Erdtree, and the Horn-Sent tutelary deities, who are far larger than your average Horn-Sent, and perhaps the sculpted keepers and horned warriors, who were also far larger, were honoured, and perhaps partook in the communion of the Shadow Tree, all of the children of Marika being large as they were descended from Marika, who is the pinnacle of the Erdtree's blessed. I think maybe this is also hinted at by Morgoth's withered form after his defeat, right? That one's size and stature can be changed based on their relative power or other factors. And if that's the case, I have a lot to say about these shriveled grandmas whose clothing appears to have outgrown them. Anyway, that concludes my first investigation into the grandmother. The next video will be Lore of the Grandmother Timeline, where I'll be attempting to put the direction of the contents of this video in order by tracing the footsteps of the grandmothers and diving into the identities of all the throned figures and the figures behind the empty ones. So subscribe if you're interested to see that. Also, if you're a Miquella fanatic, join the Shadows of Light Discord for some good old-fashioned camaraderie, lore chat, and PvP. Also, you may have noticed your boy has free cam now, so I'm planning on doing a free cam stream soon, where you can pick where I go and explore. So think of stuff you've always wanted to see but never could get to, and I'll see you at the live stream, which I'll announce through my community notifications on YouTube. Thank you for watching. Follow my lore therapist.